Welcome back, everyone. This is unit number 3. We're talking about Aperture and ISO in the same unit. So let's look at some of the vocabulary words that we're going to learn about today. We have 10 words we're going to learn. And the first word is simply aperture. And just like the word means, an aperture is an opening, a gap, or a hole. So you can see here it's inside of this lens, and there's an opening inside this lens. And as you can see, there's some blades around it that actually can adjust to different sizes to allow in less or more light. So I have an example over here of how the aperture can look different inside of a camera. So it can open up just a small amount, and it can open up a larger amount. Our second term is f-stop. So when we're referring to the different stops inside of this aperture, you're referring to an f-stop. Okay, f meaning focal length. Okay, so when it comes to f-stops, they're represented with the f and then a number over it. And you can see that there is a slash, which indicates to you that this is a fraction. So I want you to imagine the larger number where it says f over 1.4. Imagine that as being 1 over 1.4. So that's almost like a whole value like this, okay? And then if you cut it down in half, you're getting 1 over 2. So imagine that as 1/2, okay? And then it keeps going further down, and it can get all the way to f32, to a very small opening. So a lot of my students will get mixed up when I say a large aperture. A large aperture actually means the smaller number on your camera. A camera will look similar to something like this. It'll see represented as f8. And so f8, you would see right here, is a smaller hole, even though the number is higher. So just think about that slash as a fraction. The other thing I need you to know is that you're going to need to memorize these stops. A full stop, we talked about stops before. We're going to memorize these stops as they move up, because you'll be working with them, and so that when I ask you to move a stop up or a stop down, you know what that means. There are fractions of stops as well, but these are full stops. So it goes 1.4, 1.8, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. Those are the numbers I need you to memorize. Once you work with your camera more, you'll start to understand them more. The next vocabulary word is shallow depth of field. The shallow depth of field is just one single plane is in focus. So it's really shallow. Let's see if I have another example here for you. Here's one too. Shallow depth of field. A shallow depth of field, you can see one thing is in focus and everything is out of focus around that. So you can see that people would want to use this in something like portraiture so that you really focus on the subject. Whereas we're going to learn about the second vocabulary word is like a long depth of field, is where you can see everything is in focus. So your eye is moving from place to place. And here, the shallow depth of field, our eye is just focused on one area. So notice in this picture, the foreground is in focus and everything else around it is out of focus. So opposite of that would be a long depth of field. A long depth of field is when the long distance between the foreground and background is all in focus. So again, like our representation right here, you can see the foreground, middle ground, and background is in focus. And of course, there's varying degrees in between for your medium depth of field, but this is just giving you a good example of the two extremes. Those long depth of fields are represented in something like f22, f16, f11, or f32 even. Okay, so what is ISO? ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So you can change the sensitivity to light And therefore, if you're in a low light situation, you can bump up the sensitivity so that it makes your camera react faster to light. And so you can see here in this image, it's represented by 100 all the way up to 1600 right here. Some other examples up to like 4000. Your ISO can get really, really high on some of the newer cameras. But one thing you need to keep in mind is that when you are using a high ISO, let's see if we have, or I'm sorry, a low ISO, your next vocabulary word, you get greater detail, but it's less sensitive to light. So you need to be out in brighter situations or using a flash to be able to use a low ISO. So the great thing about using ISO at a low ISO is that you greater detail. That means you're not getting as much pixelation or grain in your image. But you really need good light and a good amount of light to be able to get that. So my rule of thumb is to always go as low as you can go with your ISO. Don't try to sit on a high ISO because it's going to degrade your quality. Try to go as low as you can and still be able to work with your aperture and shutter speed. High ISO is just the opposite. It makes it more sensitive to light. So you can see this is a really grainy picture here. And that's because the camera is filling in some of that information, is trying to gather as much light as possible so it adds more grain or pixelation to your image. And so there's going to be less detail. However, it's really helpful when you're in a really low light situation and you need to take a picture. This would happen if I'm inside of a dark church and I still need to take wedding pictures. I'm not allowed to use a flash. I would turn on a high ISO so I can still get the pictures I need. However, you got to keep in mind that if you try to print this out and blow it up really large, it's going to have some lower quality, image quality compared to the low ISO picture, which has nicer detail. So that brings me to pixels. Back when we were working with film, we used to talk about film grain. Now we talk about pixels, and pixels is the smallest amount of visible data in an image, and it's usually one single color. So you hear about megapixels. Megapixels is 1,000 pixels in one. So if you have a 20 megapixel camera versus a 10 megapixel camera, you're going to have the capability to do more. That's not the only thing that makes your camera good. You have to have a good lens and you have to have a good sensor, but that is one aspect that gives you good quality. And there's two photographers I want you to know about is Julie Margaret Cameron. Julie Margaret Cameron is a Victorian amateur photographer who used long exposures and short depth of field to create very soft and out of focus portraits. So here's an example of her portrait, and I have some more right here. Notice how just one area is in focus and then everything else is out of focus. So this can create some really cool effects. And let's see if I have another example here. There's another example. Okay, and you notice her hand is out of focus here, but in focus up here. So if you really use a really shallow depth of field, you can get some really cool effects. All right, so next photographer I want to look at is Sally Mann. Sally Mann is really known for doing this fantastic series on the Deep South. And so she puts just one area of the picture in focus and everything else has this hazy appearance like this. This was all about like death and decay in the Deep South. Here's some more of her images. Create an eerie effect just like that.